Scene 1. The Fair. Keith Barnett's taxi sat outside the Greyhound station on East Town Street, engine idling, burning gas he'd have to account for at shift's end. The dashboard clock read 10:37 p.m., and his third cup of coffee had gone cold in the holder beside him. He lit another Marlboro, the flame from his Zippo casting brief shadows across the cab's interior, before dying back to darkness. The radio crackled. Static, then Donna's voice from dispatch, tinny and bored. "Barnett, you still downtown?" Keith picked up the handset. "Yeah. Got a pickup. Woman needs a ride to some retreat place. Middle of nowhere. You want it?" He should say no. Should head back to the garage, clock out, go home to his efficiency apartment on South 4th, where the radiator clanked and the neighbor's television bled through the walls until midnight. But home meant sitting in the dark with his thoughts, and his thoughts had teeth these days. Keith checked his watch. The fare would be good. Hour and a half, maybe 2 hours of meter running. Cash in his pocket meant he could avoid thinking about other things for a while longer. Address: Ironwood Retreat, Route 23 to Maple Grove Road. She's waiting outside the station now. Says she'll pay cash. Tell her 5 minutes. Keith killed the radio and took a long drag on his cigarette. Through the windshield, he could see the Greyhound station's fluorescent lights, making everything look pale and sick. A few travelers lingered outside with suitcases, and the particular exhaustion that came from bus travel, that bone-deep tiredness that made people's faces go slack and empty. A woman stood apart from the others, small suitcase at her feet, arms wrapped around herself against the September cold. Even from here, Keith could see she looked worn down, dark circles visible under her eyes, shoulders hunched forward like she was trying to make herself smaller. Running from something, Keith thought. Or to something. Either way, none of my business. He stubbed out his cigarette in the overflowing ashtray and pulled the taxi up to the curb. The woman looked up as he approached, relief washing over her face. Keith popped the trunk and got out, his knees protesting. 52 years old, and his body was already starting the slow betrayal that came with age. "You the ride to Ironwood?" he asked, reaching for her suitcase. "Yes, thank you." Her voice was quiet, careful, like someone who'd gotten used to not being heard. She looked younger up close, maybe late 20s, thin in a way that spoke of stress rather than intent. A wedding ring still sat on her left hand, even though the pale band of skin beneath it suggested it hadn't been there long. Divorced, Keith guessed. Recently. He loaded her bag. "It's about an hour and a half, maybe 2 depending on the roads out there." "That's fine." She climbed into the back seat before he could open the door for her, immediately pulling out a pack of Virginia Slims. Her hands shook slightly as she found her lighter. Keith slid back behind the wheel. "Mind if I smoke?" "Please." Something like gratitude crossed her face. He lit another Marlboro and pulled away from the curb, the meter clicking to life with its familiar mechanical rhythm. The radio was already tuned to WOL, Hall & Oates singing "I Can't Go For That" at low volume, the kind of background noise that filled silence without demanding attention. They drove without talking. Keith kept his eyes on the road, and his passenger kept hers on the window, watching Columbus slide past in blocks of light and shadow. At a red light on Main Street, Keith glanced in the rearview mirror. The woman was fidgeting with her wedding ring, turning it around and around on her finger, a nervous habit she probably didn't know she had. Guilt, Keith thought, and then pushed the thought away because he didn't want to think about guilt or the things people carried in the dark. "You make this drive often?" she asked suddenly. Keith checked the mirror again. She was looking at him now, those tired eyes studying his reflection. "First time," he said. "Me too." She took a drag on her cigarette. "Need to get away for a few days." "Yeah." The conversation died as quickly as it had started, and Keith was glad. He didn't want to know her story, didn't want to hear about whatever she was running from or the reasons she needed to get away. His job was to drive her from point A to point B, collect the fare, and forget she ever existed. They left downtown, the buildings shrinking as they hit the suburbs. Houses with lit windows showing glimpses of normal lives. Families eating late dinners. Couples watching television. Kids who should have been in bed but weren't. All those small domestic scenes that Keith had once had and lost and couldn't quite remember how. The highway opened up ahead, stretching south toward darkness. Keith merged onto Route 23, the city lights fading in his mirrors, until there was nothing but road and night and the occasional glow of a distant farmhouse. The radio lost its signal gradually, Pat Benatar's voice dissolving into static before Keith turned it off entirely. In the back seat, the woman's breathing had evened out. Keith glanced in the mirror and saw her head resting against the window, eyes closed, the cigarette burned down to the filter in her fingers. He reached back carefully and took it from her before it could burn her or the upholstery, stubbing it out in his own ashtray. She didn't wake. Keith settled into the drive, the white lines on the road hypnotic in the headlights. This was the part of the job he actually liked, when it was just him and the dark and the steady hum of the engine. No passengers asking questions, no dispatch crackling demands, no thoughts crowding in to remind him of things he'd rather forget. But then he adjusted the rearview mirror, just a slight tilt to check on his sleeping passenger, and for a second he thought he saw something else in the back seat. A shape, a shadow. He blinked. Just the passenger, head against the window, alone. Tired, Keith told himself. Too much coffee, not enough sleep. He kept his eyes on the road after that and didn't look in the mirror again. Ahead, a sign appeared in the headlights, Maple Grove Road, 2 miles. Behind him, the passenger stirred but didn't wake. And in the rearview mirror, Keith refused to check. Something waited in the back seat that hadn't been there when they left Columbus. Something that knew him. Something he'd left behind to die. Scene 2. Maple Grove Road. The turn onto Maple Grove Road came up fast, almost invisible in the darkness. Keith hit the brakes harder than he meant to, the taxi's tires squealing slightly as he made the turn. The map lay open on the passenger seat, gas station paper with creases worn soft from folding and refolding, but he barely needed to look at it now. The road was obvious. The only option, cutting away from Route 23 into forest that closed around them like a fist. 2 lanes of cracked asphalt, trees pressing close on both sides. No streetlights. No houses. Just darkness and the tunnel of the taxi's headlights showing 50 feet of road before everything dissolved into black. Keith checked his fare in the side mirror. Still asleep, head resting against the window, one hand tucked under her cheek. Jennifer, her name was. She looked younger like that, vulnerable in a way that made Keith uncomfortable. He shouldn't have taken this fare. Should have told dispatch he was done for the night. But the meter was still running, and he needed the money, and turning back now would mean explaining things he didn't want to explain. He lit another cigarette with fingers that still trembled slightly. Nothing but the hum of the engine and the whisper of wind through the trees filled the silence. It was better than music anyway. Music would just remind him of the night 6 months ago, driving Norton Road south of the city, when his radio had been playing something he couldn't remember now, and he'd seen the woman on the side of the road. The woman he'd left there. Keith's breath fogged in the air. He blinked, realized the temperature in the cab had dropped maybe 10 degrees in the past minute. His fingers on the wheel felt numb. He reached for the heater controls, but they were already cranked to maximum, useless against whatever cold was seeping in. The road descended, following the contours of the land, down into what felt like a gully or hollow. The trees got thicker here, branches reaching overhead to form a canopy that blocked out even the faint starlight. Keith had to slow down, the curves coming too fast, the pavement rough and potholed from winter freeze-thaw cycles that the county never quite got around to fixing. He checked the side mirror again. Still just Jennifer, alone and asleep. But his eyes flicked involuntarily to the rearview mirror, and someone else was there. Keith's foot slipped off the gas pedal. The taxi coasted, slowing, while his brain tried to process what he was seeing. A woman stood in the back seat. No, not stood. The geometry was all wrong for standing. She was bent forward, crouched, her face pressed close to Jennifer's head like she was whispering secrets into a sleeping ear. Hospital gown. The kind patients wore, thin and shapeless, with a pattern Keith couldn't quite make out in the dim light. Torn at the shoulder, hanging wrong on her frame. Blood on her face. Dark streaks running from her hairline down her cheek. One arm hanging at an angle that made Keith's stomach turn. Bent backward at the elbow. bones broken, and her eyes. Her eyes. Black, completely black, like someone had carved holes in her face and filled them with night. She was looking at Keith through the mirror, looking right at him. Keith jerked the wheel. The taxi swerved right, tires hitting the shoulder with a grinding sound. He overcorrected left, fought for control, got the cab back on the pavement. His heart slammed against his ribs so hard he thought it might crack bone. He looked in the mirror again. Just Jennifer, head against the window, sleeping, alone. No hospital gown, no blood, no woman with broken arms and hollow eyes. Keith's hands shook on the wheel. Sweat ran down his back despite the cold. The cigarette had fallen from his lips at some point, landed somewhere in the footwell, probably burning a hole in the carpet. Not real, he told himself. Hallucination. Too tired. Too much coffee. Seeing things. But he knew what he'd seen. The hospital gown. The blood. The way she'd been crouched there, impossibly close to Jennifer, looking at Keith like she knew him. Like she'd been waiting for him. Keith forced himself to focus on the road. The curves kept coming, tight and treacherous. He had to pay attention, had to use the mirrors, had to check behind him to make sure no one was coming up fast on the turns. Except now, he was afraid to look in the rearview mirror. He used the side mirrors instead, checking traffic that didn't exist on this empty road, anything to avoid that rectangle of glass that showed what was in his back seat. But the curves got sharper, the hollow got deeper. And eventually, Keith had to look. She was there again, closer this time. Her face filling more of the mirror. That broken arm reaching forward, fingers splayed wide, pressing against the mirror's surface from within the reflection, like she was trying to push through from the other side. Her lips were moving, forming words Keith couldn't hear. The taxi drifted right. Keith corrected. His breath came short and fast. The cold in the cab had gotten worse, his breath fogging thick enough to obscure his vision. He looked away from the mirror, focused on the windshield, on the road ahead, unwinding in the headlights. But he had to look back, had to check the mirror to navigate. Every time he did, she was still there, still reaching, still mouthing words he couldn't quite hear through whatever separated them. And then, as the road curved sharply left, and Keith was forced to check the rear view to make sure the back end cleared the turn, he saw her face pressed directly against the mirror glass. Right there. So close he could count the individual strands of hair matted to her forehead with dried blood. Could see the hospital bracelet on her wrist. White paper with something printed on it. Could see the tiny flowers on the hospital gown, faded and torn. Could see that her eyes weren't just black. They were empty, hollowed out, like something had reached into her skull and scooped out everything that made her human. Recognition hit Keith like a fist to the gut. 6 months ago, Norton Road. Late April, early evening, still light enough to see. Keith had been heading back to the city from a fair in Grove City, the meter off, done for the day. The accident must have just happened. The car was still smoking in the ditch, front end crumpled. The drunk driver already fled, and on the shoulder, thrown clear, a woman. Young, maybe early 20s. Her arm bent at that same impossible angle, blood running down her face in those same dark streaks. Keith had slowed down, saw her looking at him with eyes that were still human then, still alive, still pleading, and he'd kept driving. Someone else will stop. He'd told himself, I don't want to get involved, I've got things to do. He'd checked his rearview mirror as he drove away, watched her get smaller in the glass, and then she was gone, and Keith convinced himself he'd done nothing wrong. 2 days later, he'd seen the newspaper. Woman found dead on Norton Road. Hit-and-run driver still at large. Anyone with information, please contact Columbus Police. Keith had thrown the paper away and told himself it wouldn't have mattered. That she was probably already dead when he drove past. That stopping wouldn't have changed anything. But now she was here, in his taxi, in his mirror. Wearing a hospital gown he didn't remember from the accident, didn't understand. Had she made it to a hospital? Had someone else stopped after all? Why was she wearing that? None of it made sense. But the broken arm made sense. The blood made sense. The way she looked at him made sense. She'd been on Norton Road, dying, looking at Keith as he drove away. And now she was here. The road curved right and Keith took it too fast. The taxi's weight shifted. Tires screamed. He braked hard, fighting the skid, and the cab straightened out just as they came around the bend. Jennifer jolted awake, gasping. What? What happened? Keith's eyes snapped to the rearview mirror. Just Jennifer now, sitting up, disoriented and frightened. No one else. No hospital gown. No broken arm. No blood. Sorry, Keith managed. His voice came out hoarse. Thought I saw a deer. Jennifer rubbed her eyes, looking around at the darkness pressing against the windows. Where are we? Maple Grove Road. Almost there. Keith's hands ached from gripping the wheel. Few more minutes. Okay. She settled back against the seat, but didn't go back to sleep. One hand still pressed against the window, like she was steadying herself. Keith forced himself to breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth. His father had taught him that during the war, how to calm down when the fear got too big. It hadn't helped his father much in the end, yet, but Keith used it anyway because it was all he had. The road continued descending, the hollow getting deeper. Keith could feel it now, the weight of the land pressing down, squeezing the air thin. His ears popped. The taxi's headlights seemed dimmer somehow, like the darkness was eating the light before it could reach very far. Keith kept his eyes forward, refused to look in the rearview mirror, used the side mirrors exclusively, checking for traffic that would never come. But he could feel her there, in the back seat, behind Jennifer, behind him, watching. The bridge appeared ahead, concrete span crossing Nakin Creek. Beyond it, lights, buildings, the compound Frank had mentioned, safety, maybe. Keith pressed the gas, eager to get there, eager to get out of this taxi and away from whatever was in his back seat. That's when he had to look, had to check the mirror one more time to make sure Jennifer was okay, to make sure she was real and not another hallucination brought on by exhaustion and guilt. The woman's face filled the entire rearview mirror, pressed against the glass from the inside, so close, right there. Her hollow eyes staring at Keith, her mouth opening, and this time he could hear her. You left me. The voice came from everywhere, from the radio speakers, even though the radio had been off for miles, from the heater vents, from the air itself, from inside Keith's own head. You left me. Keith slammed on the brakes. The taxi stopped hard enough to throw him forward against the seatbelt. Behind him, Jennifer let out a startled cry, bracing herself against the back of his seat. What are you doing? Her voice was sharp with fear. Keith looked in the mirror. Just Jennifer, eyes wide. Alone, no hospital gown, no broken woman with hollow eyes. Nothing. Sorry, Keith said. His voice shook. Thought I saw. There was. He couldn't finish. How did you explain seeing a dead woman in your back seat? How did you tell someone that guilt had teeth and it was eating you alive? Are you okay? Jennifer's voice was careful now, like she was talking to someone who might be dangerous. Do you need me to drive? No, I'm fine. Just tired. Keith put the taxi in gear again, hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the wheel. We're almost there. I can see the sign. He was lying. He couldn't see any sign. But ahead, maybe a quarter mile, the bridge waited, and beyond it, the lights of Ironwood Retreat. I can pay extra, Jennifer said quietly. For the trouble. For whatever's going on. Keith glanced at her in the side mirror. Her face was pale in the dashboard lights, and she was fidgeting with that wedding ring again, turning it around and around. She knew something was wrong. Could feel it, the way people could sometimes feel when the air pressure changed before a storm. Don't worry about it, Keith said. He pressed the gas, the taxi picking up speed, the bridge getting closer. The sign appeared in the headlights just before the bridge, hand-painted wood with letters that had faded but were still readable. Ironwood Retreat, vacancy. Keith didn't look in the rearview mirror again, didn't want to see what might be there, didn't want to see that broken woman's face staring at him with those hollow eyes. But as the taxi crossed the bridge over Nakin Creek, as the wheels drummed on concrete that sounded hollow underneath, Keith knew with absolute certainty that whatever had followed him from Norton Road wasn't going to stop at the property line. Some things you couldn't outrun. Some debts came due whether you wanted to pay them or not. And 6 months ago, Keith Barnett had driven past a dying woman and told himself it wasn't his problem. Now she'd found him, and she wanted to know why. Scene 3. Check-in. The parking lot of Ironwood Retreat was gravel and cracked asphalt, the kind of surface that crunched loud under tires and announced arrivals, whether you wanted them announced or not. Keith pulled the taxi into a space near the main office building, hands still shaking on the wheel, and cut the engine. The silence that followed felt like pressure, like the air itself was holding its breath. Only one other car sat in the lot. A tan Oldsmobile, maybe 5 years old, parked near what looked like Unit 3. Guest. Probably. Someone else looking to get away from something for a few days. The main office lights were on, warm yellow glow spilling through the windows into the dark. Around it, maybe 10 small units arranged in a rough semicircle, most of them dark and vacant. The whole place had the feel of something that used to be nicer, that had been well maintained once and was still hanging on through sheer stubbornness. "You coming in?" Jennifer was already out, stretching, her breath fogging in the cold. The temperature had dropped even more, Keith realized. Late September in Ohio shouldn't be this cold. "Yeah, just give me a minute." She nodded and headed for the office, her footsteps crunching on gravel. Keith sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the wheel, even though the engine was off, staring at nothing. He needed to leave. Get out of this cab, collect his fare, and drive back to Columbus right now. Forget Ironwood Retreat. Forget the woman in the back seat who wasn't there. Forget the whole thing. But his body wouldn't move. Exhaustion sat on him like a weight, pressing him down into the seat. And underneath the exhaustion was fear, the kind that made your legs feel like water and your thoughts go scattered and useless. Keith forced himself to look in the rearview mirror. His own face stared back. 52 years old, weathered from decades of smoking and coffee and driving through Columbus nights. Tired eyes. Guilty eyes. The face of a man who'd made one terrible choice and couldn't unmake it no matter how many miles he drove. Nothing else. No hospital gown, no broken arm, no woman with hollow eyes. But she'd been there. Keith knew she'd been there. Could still feel the way his skin had crawled when her face pressed against the mirror glass from the inside. He checked the meter. $42.60. Long fare, good money, enough to make the trip worth it if he ignored everything else that had happened on the drive. He lit a cigarette, with shaking hands, took a long drag, and climbed out of the taxi. The cold hit him immediately, sharper than it had any right to be. Keith grabbed Jennifer's suitcase from the trunk and walked toward the office, gravel crunching underfoot. The door was propped open slightly, and he could hear voices inside. Low, professional, the sound of a transaction being conducted. Keith pushed the door wider and stepped into warmth that felt like a reprieve. The office was small and functional. A desk, filing cabinets, a coffee maker on a corner table, with a pot that looked like it had been sitting there since morning. Maps on the wall showing the local area, roads and creeks marked in faded ink. And behind the desk, a man who looked like he'd been doing this job for a very long time. Late 40s, maybe, with the weathered skin and calloused hands that came from outdoor work. Something in his eyes suggested he'd seen things, the kind of things people didn't talk about in normal conversation. He was watching Jennifer fill out a guest book, and his expression was carefully neutral. "How many nights?" he asked. 4. Maybe 3. I'll let you know." Jennifer's voice was steadier than it had been in the taxi, like solid ground made her more confident. "Unit 5, quiet, faces the woods." The man pulled a key from a pegboard behind him and set it on the desk. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out something that made Keith's skin prickle. An iron horseshoe. Old, pitted with rust, heavy-looking even from across the room. "Put this above your door. Inside, above the frame. Nails already there." Jennifer picked up the horseshoe, turning it over in her hands. "Is that necessary?" "Old tradition. Humor me." She nodded, clearly thinking this was some kind of rural superstition, the sort of thing small-town people clung to. Keith knew better. Or was starting to. The man behind the desk hadn't looked at Keith yet, but Keith could feel his attention anyway, the way you could feel someone watching you even when they weren't obviously doing it. Siren already went off tonight, 8:47. Goes off every night at that time. The man's expression was serious. "From now on, you'll want to be inside your unit before it sounds. Door locked." "Storm warning?" Jennifer asked. "Something like that." He pushed the key toward her. "Get to your unit quickly tonight. Don't linger outside after dark. She took her key and the horseshoe and headed for the door, picking up her suitcase as she passed Keith with a tired smile. Thank you. For the ride. She pulled bills from her purse, 2 20s and a 10. Keep the change. Keith nodded, pocketing the 50. The fare was $42.60. Generous tip, but after what he'd put her through on that drive, he wasn't going to argue. No problem. Keith watched through the window as she crossed the parking lot to Unit 5. The gravel crunched under her feet, the sound carrying in the cold night air. She unlocked the door, went inside, and the lights came on behind the curtains. Safe, for now. Keith turned back to find the man behind the desk watching him. Not suspicious, exactly. More like someone studying a problem they'd seen before and were trying to decide how to approach. Coffee's terrible, but it's hot, the man said, gesturing to the pot in the corner. Keith needed coffee the way a drowning man needed air. He poured himself a cup in a styrofoam cup, took a sip, and confirmed that yes, it was terrible. Burnt and bitter and probably 6 hours old. He drank it anyway. I'm just the driver, Keith said. Wasn't planning to stay. The man nodded slowly. Long drive back, and it's past midnight. Keith glanced at the clock on the wall. 12:17 a.m. Wow, had it really been that long since they left Columbus? I'll sleep in the cab. Take Unit 8, no charge, but you follow the same rules. The man stood and selected another key from the pegboard. His movements were economical, practiced, like someone who'd done this too many times to need to think about it. Keith started to refuse, wanted to refuse, but something stopped him, some instinct that said sleeping in the cab was a bad idea tonight, a very bad idea. Why? Keith heard himself ask. The man pulled another iron horseshoe from the drawer, set it on the desk next to the key. Because something followed you here, and it won't leave until you face it. Keith's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. What? You saw her in the back seat. The woman in the hospital gown. I saw her too, through your windshield when you pulled in. She was standing behind your fare, watching you. The man's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was commenting on the weather. And she's not going to let you leave until you deal with what you did. Keith set the coffee down. His hands were shaking again. How do you know what I saw? I've been doing this job for 4 years, running this place, watching who comes and who goes, and what follows them. The man extended his hand. Frank Harmon. Keith shook it automatically. The grip was firm, brief. Keith Barnett. Mr. Barnett. Frank pushed the key and horseshoe across the desk. I'll tell you the same thing I told your fare. Hang the iron above your door. Inside, above the frame. Be in your unit before 8:47. Door locked. And when you see her again, because you will see her again, don't turn around. Don't turn around? She appears in reflections. Mirrors, windows, any surface that shows your reflection back to you. But she's only in the reflection. If you turn around to look at where she should be standing, if you try to face her directly. Frank trailed off, shook his head. Don't do that. Keith wanted to laugh. Wanted to tell Frank he was insane, that none of this was real, that dead women didn't follow taxi drivers around in reflections. But he'd seen her. Multiple times. Couldn't deny what his own eyes had shown him. What is she? Keith asked quietly. Something old. Something that feeds on guilt. It's called the passenger, because it rides with people who've left someone behind, who've failed to help when they should have. Frank's expression was grim. You drove past a dying woman 6 months ago, left her on Norton Road, and now she wants to know why. Keith's legs went weak. He grabbed the edge of the desk to steady himself. I'm leaving at dawn. You can try. Frank's voice wasn't unkind. But that thing in your mirrors won't stop following you just because you drove away from Ironwood. It'll be in your rear view all the way back to Columbus, in your bathroom mirror when you shave, in every window that shows your reflection. Eventually, you'll break. Everyone does. So what am I supposed to do? Face it. Confess what you did and why you did it. Speak the truth to her reflection and mean it. That's the only way to make it stop. Keith picked up the horseshoe and the key. The metal was cold and heavy in his hand. And if I can't? Frank met his eyes. Then you'll end up like the others, found dead with water in your lungs even though you drowned on dry land. Keith walked to the door, stopped, looked back. You believe in this stuff? Really? I've pulled 3 bodies out of units over the past 4 years, Mr. Barnett. All drowned, all with creek water in their lungs and no water anywhere near them. Frank picked up a clipboard from his desk, flipped through papers. I believe what I see. Keith stepped out into the cold, the horseshoe heavy in his hand. Across the parking lot, Unit 8 waited. Behind him, his taxi sat in the gravel lot, the back seat visible through the windows. Empty. But for how long? Keith walked toward Unit 8, gravel crunching under his feet. The key turned smoothly in the lock. The door opened to reveal a small, clean space. Basic. Temporary. Safe, as long as he followed the rules. He looked at the horseshoe in his hand. Old superstition. Rural folklore. The kind of thing people laughed about in daylight. Except Keith had seen that broken woman's face in his rearview mirror, had heard her voice saying, "You left me." And Frank's words kept echoing in his head. "Don't turn around." Keith stepped inside Unit 8 and closed the door behind him. Tomorrow he'd leave. Drive back to Columbus and forget any of this happened. But tonight he'd follow the rules. Tonight he'd hang the iron. Scene 4. First night. Unit 8 was exactly what Keith expected. Small room, kitchenette with a mini fridge and 2-burner stove, bed pushed against the wall, bathroom door standing ajar. The kind of place you stayed when you were passing through, when you needed somewhere to sleep that wasn't your car or the streets. A mirror hung above the dresser, large, clean, reflecting the room back at Keith with perfect clarity. He set the horseshoe on the counter and stared at it. Frank's instructions had been clear. Hang it above the door, inside, above the frame, on the nail that was already there. Simple. Easy. The kind of thing that shouldn't matter at all. Except it did matter. Keith could feel it the way you could feel a storm coming, pressure building in the air, static making your skin prickle. He walked to the bathroom first, turned on the light. Small space, white tile, toilet and sink, and a shower stall with a plastic curtain. Everything functional and impersonal, and above the sink, another mirror. Keith avoided looking at it directly, washed his hands, splashed water on his face, kept his eyes down. When he had to look up, when he couldn't avoid it anymore, he saw only himself. Tired, guilty, alone, no hospital gown, no broken arm, no woman with hollow eyes. Relief washed over him so strongly his knees went weak. Maybe it had been exhaustion after all. Stress, and too much coffee, and the long drive playing tricks on his mind. Maybe Frank was just a small-town crazy who'd built an entire mythology around normal deaths. Maybe Keith could sleep a few hours and drive back to Columbus at dawn and forget any of this happened. He turned off the bathroom light and walked back to the main room. The bed looked comfortable enough. He still wore his work clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt that smelled like cigarette smoke and old coffee, but he didn't care. He'd sleep in worse. Keith lay down fully clothed, one arm behind his head, staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet. No traffic noise, no neighbors, nothing but the faint whisper of wind through the trees outside. After Columbus, after years of sirens and car horns and the constant hum of the city, the silence felt heavy, oppressive. His eyes drifted closed. He dozed. Not deep sleep, just exhaustion pulling him under for a moment, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10. He jerked awake to silence so complete it felt like pressure against his eardrums. Keith sat up on the bed, disoriented, not sure what had woken him. The room was still. The horseshoe still sat on the counter where he'd left it, not hanging above the door like it should be. Idiot. He was an idiot. Frank had warned him, had told him exactly what to do, and Keith had ignored it because he was too stubborn or too tired or too convinced that none of this could be real. He started to stand, to walk over and hang the horseshoe properly. That's when he saw the bathroom mirror. The door stood open, the bathroom dark except for the faint light bleeding in from the main room. And in the mirror above the sink, just barely visible in the shadows, something moved. Keith froze. The shape resolved slowly. A figure, standing in the bathroom, standing right where Keith would be standing if he walked in there. Hospital gown, torn at the shoulder, one arm hanging at an impossible angle. Sarah Connolly. Keith's breath stopped in his chest. He couldn't move, couldn't think. Could only watch as the figure in the mirror turned its head slowly, looking at him, those eyes. Black holes where eyes should be. Looking at him across the space between the mirror and reality. Her lips moved. Keith couldn't hear through the distance, through the glass, but he could read the words forming on her broken face. "Why didn't you stop?" Keith's hands clenched in the bedsheet. His rational mind screamed that this wasn't real, couldn't be real, that dead women didn't appear in mirrors 6 months after they died. But his body knew better. His body recognized death when it saw it. He should close the bathroom door, should get up and hang the horseshoe and lock himself in and wait for dawn. Should do anything except sit here staring at the reflection of something that shouldn't exist. But he couldn't move. Sarah Connolly's reflection stepped closer to the mirror, pressed her face against it from the inside, like she was trying to push through the glass. Her breath fogged the surface, even though there was no breath in her lungs, no life in her body, nothing but whatever remained when guilt wouldn't let the dead rest. Keith forced himself to stand. His legs shook, but they held. He walked to the bathroom door, hand reaching for the knob. In the mirror, Sarah's reflection moved with him, following, matching his steps, getting closer. Keith slammed the bathroom door shut. The sound echoed in the small space like a gunshot. He stood there, breathing hard, staring at the closed door. Silence. Then, barely audible, a sound from the other side. Tapping. Fingernails on glass. Steady, patient, waiting. Keith grabbed the horseshoe from the counter and walked to the front door. The nail was there, just like Frank said, driven into the wood above the frame. Keith hooked the horseshoe over it, made sure it was secure. Old iron, cold and heavy and real. The tapping from the bathroom stopped. Keith stood at the front door, one hand on the knob, tempted to just leave right now. Walk to his taxi, drive away, deal with whatever followed him back to Columbus. At least in Columbus he knew the streets, knew where he could go, knew how to navigate familiar territory. But Frank's words came back. It'll be in your rear view all the way back. Eventually, you'll break. Everyone does. Keith turned back to the room, looked at the closed bathroom door, then at the mirror above the dresser. His reflection stared back. Just him, tired, scared, alone. Then something moved behind his reflection, just at the edge of the mirror's frame. A shape resolving out of shadow. Hospital gown. Broken arm. Blood on her face. Sarah Connolly, standing behind Keith in the reflection. Close enough to touch. Keith spun around. Nothing there. Just empty space where the reflection said something stood. He turned back to the mirror. She was still there, right behind his reflection's shoulder, looking at him with those hollow eyes. Her lips moved again. You left me to die. Keith backed away from the mirror until his shoulders hit the wall. The horseshoe above the door seemed impossibly far away now, useless against what was already inside the room with him. I'm sorry, Keith whispered to the empty room. God, I'm sorry. The reflection didn't change. Sarah Connolly stood there, broken and bloody and patient, waiting for something more than apology. Keith grabbed the iron poker from beside the fireplace he hadn't noticed before. The metal was heavy in his hands, solid and real, and the only weapon he could think of. He held it between himself and the mirror like it might protect him. The reflection of Sarah smiled, or tried to. Her face was too broken to make the expression work properly, lips pulling back to show teeth that looked too white against the blood. Her voice came from everywhere and nowhere, from the mirror and the walls and inside Keith's own head. Sorry doesn't bring me back. The poker trembled in Keith's grip. What do you want? The truth. I saw you on the side of the road. You'd been hit, thrown from your car. I could see you were hurt bad. And Keith's voice cracked. I kept driving. I told myself someone else would stop, that I didn't want to get involved, that I had fares waiting. The reflection leaned closer, her face filling more of the mirror. Why? Because I was scared. The words poured out now, unstoppable, because stopping would mean police reports and questions and my night getting complicated. Because I chose convenience over your life. Because I'm a coward. Sarah's reflection screamed. Soundless, just her mouth opening too wide, her broken jaw dislocating, black pouring from her throat like water. The mirror rippled like liquid, her reflection distorting. Then she was gone. Keith stood there, poker raised, breathing so hard his chest ached. The mirror showed only his own reflection now. Just him, wild-eyed and terrified, holding an iron poker like a weapon against nothing. Minutes passed. 5. 10. Keith didn't lower the poker, didn't move from his position against the wall. Just watched the mirror and the closed bathroom door and the shadows in the corners where the light didn't quite reach. The clock on the nightstand read 2:47 a.m. Dawn was still hours away. Keith sat in the chair by the window, poker across his knees, and waited. Sleep was impossible. Every time his eyes started to close, every time exhaustion tried to drag him under, he'd see that broken face in his mind and jerk awake. At 3:15 a.m., he heard tapping at the window. Soft. Deliberate. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps again. Keith looked at the glass. His reflection stared back, distorted slightly by the darkness outside and the lamp inside, and behind his reflection, barely visible, a pale shape pressed against the window from the outside. Hospital gown. Broken arm. Sarah Connolly, standing in the cold September night, tapping on the glass. Her hand was on the window where his reflection showed, but when Keith turned to look at where she should actually be standing, there was nothing. Just darkness and trees and empty space. "Don't turn around," Frank had said. Keith faced the window again, forced himself to look at the reflection. Sarah's face was pressed against the glass now. So close he could see the individual strands of her hair matted with blood. Could see the hospital bracelet on her wrist, with her name printed in block letters. Could see the way her lips kept moving, forming the same words over and over. "You left me. You left me. You left me." "I know," Keith said to the reflection. "I know I did." The tapping stopped. The reflection faded, dissolving like mist, until there was nothing in the window but Keith's own face staring back at him. He sat in the chair and waited for dawn, the poker never leaving his grip. When pale grey light finally started filtering through the curtains, when the darkness gave up its hold and pulled back to wherever darkness went during the day, Keith stood on shaking legs and walked to the bathroom. The mirror above the sink showed only his reflection when he opened the door. Haggard, exhausted, but alone. Keith splashed water on his face. His hands trembled so badly he could barely hold them under the faucet. In the mirror, for just a moment, Sarah Connolly stood behind him, close enough that her breath should have fogged his neck, close enough to touch. Then she was gone. Keith dried his hands and walked back to the main room. The horseshoe still hung above the door. The poker leaned against the chair where he'd left it. Everything looked normal in the morning light. But Keith knew better now. Normal was a lie. The horseshoe had protected him, barely, but it hadn't stopped Sarah from appearing, hadn't stopped her from speaking, hadn't done anything except keep her on the other side of some invisible threshold. And tonight would come again, and the night after that. Keith grabbed his cigarettes and lighter and walked outside. The parking lot was quiet in the dawn light, gravel still damp with dew. His taxi sat where he'd left it, yellow paint looking pale and sickly in the grey light. Keith walked to the driver's side door, keys in hand. Then he stopped. In the car window, in the reflection of the morning, Sarah Connolly sat in the back seat, watching him, waiting. Keith's keys fell from his hand, hit the gravel with a metallic clink. She was in the taxi now. In his taxi. The thing he used to make his living, to navigate Columbus, to exist in the world. He couldn't drive away, couldn't escape to familiar territory, because she'd followed him there too. Keith bent down, picked up his keys with shaking hands, and walked back toward Unit 8. Frank had been right. The only way forward was through. And tonight, Keith would have to face the truth he'd been running from for 6 months. The truth about what he'd done, and why he'd really kept driving. Scene 5, morning after. Keith stepped out of Unit 8 into cold October air that smelled of wet leaves and exhaust. The sun sat low and pale behind the trees, doing nothing to cut the chill. His eyes felt like they'd been rubbed with sandpaper, and his mouth tasted like an ashtray. 4 cigarettes before dawn, chain smoking while he'd watched that bathroom door and waited for Sarah Connolly to come back. She hadn't. Not after he'd hung the iron horseshoe, but that didn't mean she was gone. Keith's taxi sat where he'd left it, yellow paint catching the weak sunlight. Morning mist still clung to the parking lot, turning the gravel into something ghostly and unreal. Only one other car visible, that tan Oldsmobile near Unit 3, same as last night. He'd seen Sarah in the taxi's window at dawn, sitting in the back seat where Jennifer Morrison had dozed off on the drive here, watching him with those hollow eyes, waiting. Keith approached the taxi cautiously and checked the side mirror. Just his own reflection stared back. Empty back seat. No hospital gown, no broken arm, no hollow eyes. Maybe she was only there at dawn. Maybe whatever held him here would let him go in daylight. Keith slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. Click. Nothing. Not even the cough of an engine trying to turn over. Just that dead, hollow sound of a battery that wouldn't give. He tried again. Click, click, click. Come on. Keith pumped the gas pedal even though he knew it wouldn't help. Don't do this to me. Click, click, click. The battery had been fine last night. He'd checked it before leaving Columbus. Checked everything, the way he always did before a long fare. The cab had started without a hiccup when he'd pulled into this parking lot at midnight. Now it was dead. Keith slammed his palm against the steering wheel. The horn blared loud enough to wake the dead, echoing off the units and the trees beyond. He sat there breathing hard, forehead pressed against the wheel, trapped, just like Frank said he would be. Car trouble? Keith jerked upright. Frank Harmon stood 10 feet away, thermos in one hand, the other in his jacket pocket. The groundskeeper looked like he'd been awake for hours, eyes clear and alert in a way that made Keith want to punch him. Battery's dead, Keith said, climbing out. His knees cracked. Was fine last night. Happens sometimes. Frank unscrewed the thermos cap and poured himself coffee that steamed in the cold air. Let me get the jumper cables. He walked to the maintenance shed and came back with cables, popped the hood of a battered pickup truck Keith hadn't noticed before. They worked in silence, connecting positive to positive, negative to ground. Frank's truck rumbled to life. They waited. 5 minutes. 10. Keith tried his ignition. Click, click, click. Battery's not the problem, Frank said, unhooking the cables. Something else. Starter? Alternator? Could be. Won't know without proper tools. Frank packed the cables away. Nearest mechanic is in town. 7 miles. Opens at noon on Saturdays. He took a sip of coffee, watching Keith over the rim. You could walk it. Take you a couple hours. Keith looked at the road leading out of the compound. It disappeared into the trees, winding back toward Maple Grove Road and Route 23, and the world beyond this place. 2 hours through woods that felt like they were watching. 2 hours with every puddle and car window showing him Sarah Connolly's broken face. Yeah, he said finally. Maybe. Frank's expression said he knew Keith wasn't walking anywhere. Keith pulled out his Marlboros and lit one with shaking hands. You said it gets stronger each night. That's right. How much stronger? Frank poured more coffee into his thermos cap. Tonight'll be worse than last night. Third night's usually when people break, when they turn around. And then they drown. Most of them. Frank's voice stayed level. Found a woman in Unit 7 back in 80. Drowned in her bathtub. Water was only 6 inches deep, but her lungs were full of creek water. Coroner said it was impossible. I stopped trying to explain it to them after that. Keith took a long drag. The smoke burned, but it steadied his hands. The confession, does it always work? If you mean it, really mean it, not just saying words but speaking the truth you've been hiding from yourself. Frank met his eyes. Most people can't do that. They apologize for feeling guilty. They say they're sorry, but they don't say why they really did what they did. The ugly reason. The unforgivable part. What if I don't know what that is? Then you'd better figure it out before tonight. Frank started walking toward the maintenance shed, then stopped. The passenger knows. It's been watching you for 6 months, feeding on your guilt. It knows the truth, even if you won't admit it. Keith stood alone by his dead taxi, smoking and watching Frank disappear into the shed. The morning sun climbed higher, but did nothing to warm the hollow. Movement caught his eye. Jennifer Morrison emerged from Unit 5, looking like she'd aged 10 years overnight. Dark circles under her eyes, hair uncombed, moving like every joint hurt. She saw Keith and hesitated, clearly not wanting company. But she crossed the parking lot anyway. Morning, she said, her voice rough. Either of you know if there's coffee? Main office, maybe. Keith gestured with his cigarette toward the building. Frank had some earlier. Might still be a pot on. Thanks. She started toward the office, then stopped. Looked back at him. You saw something last night, didn't you? Keith met her eyes. Saw his own exhaustion reflected there. His own terror. Yeah, me too. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. My kids, but wrong. All wrong. Frank appeared from the shed carrying jumper cables. Coffee's in the office, Miss Morrison. Help yourself. Jennifer nodded and hurried toward the main building, arms wrapped around herself against the cold. Keith watched her go, then turned back to Frank. Is she seeing something? Yeah. Frank connected the cables to his truck's battery. Different from yours. The passenger takes different forms for different people, shows them who they left behind. Keith thought about Jennifer asking about coffee, the way her hands had shaken, the dark circles under her eyes. We should warn her. She already knows something's wrong, just like you did. Frank attached the other end of the cables to Keith's taxi. Whether she believes it's real or thinks she's losing her mind, that's up to her. They tried jumping the battery. The engine clicked and whined, but wouldn't catch. Frank disconnected the cables after 5 minutes. Not the battery, he said. Starter, maybe. Or the alternator. Can't tell without proper tools. So I'm stuck here until Monday. Looks that way. Monday. 2 more nights. Keith looked at Unit 8, at the door with the iron horseshoe hanging above it. 2 more nights with Sarah Connolly getting stronger, getting closer, demanding he turn around and face her. Frank coiled the jumper cables. You've got a choice to make. Tonight or never. After tonight, it'll be too strong. It won't be asking anymore. It'll be taking. That's right. Frank tossed the cables in his truck bed. Whatever you're going to confess, Mr. Barnett, you'd better figure it out soon, because the passenger already knows, and it's not going to wait much longer. Keith stood alone in the parking lot after Frank left, finishing his cigarette and staring at nothing. Sarah Connolly, 23 years old, dead on Route 23 while he drove away. He told himself someone else would stop, that it wasn't his problem, that he had fares waiting. But that wasn't the whole truth. Frank was right about that. There was something uglier underneath. Something Keith had buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it didn't exist. Tonight he'd have to dig it up, or drown trying. Scene 6. Jennifer's day. The office coffee had been terrible, burnt and bitter, but Jennifer had drunk a cup anyway while she made her phone call. Now back in Unit 5, she made instant coffee in her kitchenette, because at least she could control how bad it tasted. She stood at the counter with both hands wrapped around the mug for warmth. She turned the heat up as high as it would go, but couldn't seem to get warm. The chill had nothing to do with the October morning, and everything to do with what she'd seen in the bathroom mirror at 3 a.m. Emma and Michael, standing behind her reflection. Too pale. Hair wet like they'd been swimming. But wrong. Everything about them wrong. Jennifer's hands shook enough that coffee sloshed over the rim and burned her thumb. She set the mug down and ran cold water over the burn, refusing to look at the faucet's chrome finish. Anything reflective was dangerous now. She'd learned that last night. The coffee was gone by the time she forced herself to sit at the small table. A deck of cards sat in the drawer. She'd found them last night, tried to play solitaire to distract herself from the voices outside. Hadn't worked. The voices had kept coming through her earplugs, muffled but persistent. Mummy, we're cold. Jennifer pushed the cards away, stood at the window instead, staring out at the parking lot. Nothing to see but gravel and Keith's dead taxi and the woods beyond. Nothing to distract her from her children or her ex-husband, or the way her mother's voice kept echoing in her head. You're being irresponsible, Jennifer. You can't trust Rob. You know you can't. She turned away from the window before she could see her reflection forming in the glass. The bench outside Unit 5 had morning sun and a view of the parking lot that didn't include any windows or mirrors. Jennifer took her cigarettes and sat there trying to convince herself she was relaxing, that this was what she'd come here for, peace and quiet and time to herself. The cigarette tasted better than the coffee. She smoked and tried not to think, and tried not to look at anything reflective. Tried not to think about Emma and Michael waking up in Rob's apartment, about whether they'd eaten breakfast, whether they were watching Saturday morning cartoons, whether Rob was sober or had already started drinking the way he used to when they were still married. 3 months sober, she reminded herself. The longest stretch in years. He's doing better. But her mother's voice wouldn't shut up. What if he's not? What if something happens and you're not there? The phone call hadn't helped. Rob had been annoyed, defensive, hung up on her before she could even talk to the kids. She'd wanted to hear their voices, needed that reassurance. Instead, she'd gotten Rob's irritation and the dial tone buzzing in her ear like an accusation. Everything was fine. The kids were fine. Rob was fine. So why did she feel worse? She bought a vending machine sandwich from the office and ate it on the bench outside Unit 5. The parking lot was empty except for her taxi and Keith's dead cab. Frank was somewhere doing his groundskeeper work. Keith had probably gone back to his unit. Both of them trapped here, waiting for night to fall. By afternoon, Jennifer couldn't sit still anymore. She walked the grounds, following a path that wound behind the main building. The pool appeared suddenly, a concrete basin maybe 20 feet across, surrounded by an iron fence. Dark water sat at the bottom, maybe 3 feet deep, black with algae and stagnant. The iron fence posts looked newer than the pool itself, the welds still clean. Jennifer stopped at the fence line, not getting too close. Something about the water made her uncomfortable. It didn't move, didn't ripple in the breeze. Just sat there like oil. For just a second, less than a heartbeat, she saw them. Emma and Michael, down in that black water, looking up at her through the murk. Too pale, hair floating around their faces, eyes hollow and accusing, small hands reaching up toward the surface like they were drowning. Their mouths moved in unison. "Mommy, where are you? We need you." Jennifer stumbled backward, away from the fence. She looked again and saw only that black water, perfectly still, reflecting nothing. She turned and walked away quickly, not looking back at the pool. But she'd seen them. She knew she had. She ran back to Unit 5 and locked the door behind her. 5 o'clock. The sun was already sinking toward the tree line, turning everything gold and red and beautiful in a way that made her want to scream. Soon it would be dark. Soon the siren would sound. Soon she'd have to face another night in this place. Jennifer found the mini bottle of vodka she'd packed and poured it into her coffee mug, drank it fast, hoping it would steady her nerves. It didn't. Just made her dizzy and sick. She sat at the table with her back to the window, refusing to look at the darkening glass, but she could feel her reflection forming anyway, could sense something standing behind it. The curtains were thick enough to block most of the light. Jennifer closed them and checked the iron horseshoe above the door. Still there. Still secure. Frank had said it would help. She lay on the bed fully clothed and closed her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have left you." But she didn't know who she was apologizing to. Her real children, safe in Columbus with their father. Or the things wearing their faces, waiting in the mirrors for night to fall. Either way, the apology felt hollow. Either way, she knew it wasn't enough. Scene 7. Crossing paths. The sun was sinking toward the tree line when Keith emerged from Unit 8, restless and sick of staring at the walls. He'd tried sleeping, couldn't. Tried sitting, couldn't. Every surface in that room reflected something, and even with the horseshoe hung properly, he kept seeing movement at the edge of mirrors. Better to be outside while there was still daylight left. Jennifer Morrison sat on the bench outside Unit 5, smoking, staring at nothing. She looked worse than this morning, eyes red-rimmed, face pale, moving when she brought the cigarette to her lips like her whole body ached. Keith walked over. Couldn't say why exactly. Maybe just because she was the only other person here who knew. Who'd seen it too. "Mind if I sit?" She glanced up, seemed to take a moment to place him, then nodded. "Sure." Keith sat on the other end of the bench, lit his own cigarette. They smoked in silence for a minute, he watching the shadows stretch across the parking lot. "I saw them again," Jennifer said quietly. "This afternoon, in the pool behind the main building. They were in the water, looking up at me." Keith nodded. "Yeah, it doesn't stop during the day, just gets quieter." "Frank said it would be worse tonight." Her voice shook slightly. "How much worse can it get?" Keith thought about Sarah Connolly's face filling every mirror in Unit 8 last night, about her voice demanding he turn around, about the way the water had started seeping under the door until he'd hung the horseshoe. "I don't know, but I don't think either of us wants to find out." Jennifer stubbed out her cigarette and immediately lit another one. "I called my ex-husband this morning to check on the kids. He hung up on me before I could even talk to them, said I was checking up on him, not them." "Were you?" "Yes, no, both." She laughed, hollow. I don't even know anymore. I just know I left them with him and came here, and now I can't stop thinking about what if something happens. What if he drinks? What if they need me and I'm not there? And the thing in the mirrors knows that, Keith said. Knows exactly what you're afraid of. What about yours? The woman you saw? Keith told her about Sarah Connolly, about driving past her on Norton Road 6 months ago, about seeing her broken and bleeding on the shoulder and choosing to keep driving, about reading her obituary 2 days later and knowing he could have saved her. Jennifer listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. You really think confessing will make it stop? Frank says it will, if we mean it, if we say the real truth, not just the easy version. What's the real truth? Jennifer's voice was barely above a whisper. Keith thought about that, about what he'd told himself for 6 months, that he'd been too busy, that someone else would stop, that it wasn't his responsibility. But underneath all that was something uglier, something he hadn't wanted to look at. I don't know yet, he admitted, but I think I'll figure it out tonight, one way or another. The sun touched the tree line. Keith checked his watch. 7:30, little more than an hour until the siren. We should head in soon, he said, before it gets dark. Jennifer stood, wrapping her arms around herself. Yeah. Keith stood too. They were outside her door, and Unit 8 was across the parking lot, maybe 50 feet away. He felt exposed out here in the open, away from locked doors and iron horseshoes. The woods seemed to be watching, the pool behind the main building, the windows of empty units. If you need anything tonight, Jennifer said. If it gets too bad, you can knock, I'll hear you. Same for you. Unit 8. She nodded and started toward her door, then stopped. Keith, do you think we'll make it through tonight? He wanted to lie, wanted to tell her everything would be fine, but the fear in her eyes deserved honesty. I don't know, but we made it through last night. That's something. Yeah, she didn't sound convinced. That's something. Jennifer disappeared into Unit 5. Keith heard the door lock, the deadbolt slide home. He walked to Unit 8 and did the same, checking the iron horseshoe one more time. Still secure, still there. The clock on the nightstand read 7:43. Keith sat in the chair facing the bathroom door and waited. At 8:47, the siren split the evening air, long, loud, final. When it cut off, the silence felt alive. Keith didn't move from the chair, just sat there, watching the bathroom door, watching the window, watching every surface that might show him Sarah Connolly's broken face. Outside, full dark had fallen. Inside, the shadows were already moving. Scene 8, second night, parallel manifestations. The solitaire game wasn't working. Jennifer laid out the cards for the 5th time, trying to focus on red on black, building down by rank, but the numbers and suits kept blurring together. Her hands wouldn't stay steady enough to place them properly. Every light in Unit 5 blazed. She'd turned on everything, overhead, lamps, even the bathroom light with the door open wide. The brightness should have been comforting. Instead, it just made the shadows in the corners look darker, made every reflective surface stand out like a beacon. Small voices drifted through the walls, muffled, distant. Mommy. Jennifer pulled the earplugs from her purse and jammed them in her ears. She'd brought them, thinking she might need them to sleep, that maybe her neighbors would be loud. Hadn't imagined she'd need them to block out her children's voices calling from outside in the dark. The earplugs helped, a little, made the voices sound underwater and far away, but they didn't stop completely, never stopped completely. Mommy, we're cold. Jennifer gathered up the cards with shaking hands and put them back in the drawer, stood at the table with nowhere to go, nothing to do, but wait for whatever was coming. The towel he'd draped over the bathroom mirror kept slipping. Keith had tucked it behind the frame, but gravity kept pulling one corner loose, leaving a sliver of reflection visible in the gap. He couldn't bring himself to go back in there and fix it. Couldn't make himself get that close to the mirror again. The window was worse. He could close the curtains, but that would mean walking close to the glass, close to where Sarah's reflection watched and waited. And he needed the curtains open so he could see outside, see if anything was moving out there in the dark. So he sat in the chair facing the kitchenette, back to the window, and tried not to look at anything reflective. The chrome fixtures on the sink caught his attention anyway, and the blank TV screen propped on the dresser, and the metal lamp base beside the bed. Every surface seemed designed to show him what he didn't want to see. Movement in the window. Keith felt it more than saw it. The temperature in the room dropped, despite the radiator clanking away beneath the sill. His breath fogged in front of his face. He couldn't help it. He looked. Sarah Connolly paced back and forth behind his reflection, her hospital gown torn and bloody, her broken arm swinging at a wrong angle. Her mouth moved constantly. Coward! 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 Keith covered his eyes with his hands. That didn't help either. He could still feel her watching. Jennifer. The vodka was gone, and Jennifer needed to use the bathroom. She'd been putting it off for an hour, drinking water to try to dilute the alcohol in her system, but her bladder wouldn't be ignored any longer. The bathroom mirror showed only her own reflection at first. Jennifer washed her hands at the sink, watching her face in the glass. Pale, drawn, dark circles under her eyes. She looked like her mother had looked after Jennifer's father died, that same haunted exhaustion. Then they appeared. Emma and Michael, standing behind her reflection. Closer than last night. Close enough that Jennifer could see details, the wetness of their hair, the way their skin looked grey in the fluorescent light, how their eyes were completely hollow, black holes where eyes should be. Their hands reached for her shoulders. "Why did you leave us with Daddy?" Emma's voice came through the mirror like it was travelling underwater. "He drinks. You know he drinks." Jennifer's mouth went dry. "He's been sober for 3 months. He's drinking right now." Michael's voice, but wrong. Too flat. "Can't you hear him? He's yelling. We're scared." Jennifer spun around. Nothing. Just the empty bathroom, clean white tile and chrome fixtures. She looked back at the mirror. Emma and Michael stood motionless, staring at her with those hollow eyes. Their mouths moved in unison now. "Please come home. Please. We need you." Jennifer backed out of the bathroom and closed the door, leaned against it, heart hammering. She could hear them through the wood, still calling, still begging. Keith. Keith tried to light a cigarette, but his hands shook too badly. The third match broke before he could get it to the tobacco. He gave up and dropped the Marlboro on the floor, hands covering his face. Sarah Connolly was everywhere. The window, the TV screen, the chrome lamp base. Even the surface of his cold coffee reflected her broken face. And she wouldn't stop talking. "You saw me. You slowed down. You looked right at me, and you drove away." Keith couldn't tell which reflection was speaking. Maybe all of them. The voices layered over each other until they became a chorus of accusation. "I had a mother. I had a sister. They waited at the hospital. I died alone." "Stop," Keith whispered. "You could have called 911. You could have stopped. You could have saved me. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't change anything." Keith's hands fell to his lap. He looked at the window. Sarah's face filled the reflection. Pressed so close to the glass, it looked like she was trying to push through from the other side. "You're right," he said. "It doesn't." "Jennifer, 11. Jennifer sat on the bed crying, mascara running down her face in black streams. The children in the window reflection had gotten louder, more insistent. Their hollow eyes bored into her back, even though she refused to look. "Daddy's hurting, Emma." Michael's voice, so real she could almost believe it. "You have to come home. Mommy, please." Emma, crying now. "It hurts." Jennifer stood, walked to the door. Her hand found the deadbolt and started to turn it. She could leave. Right now. Walk to the office, make Frank call her a cab, drive back to Columbus, check on them, make sure they were okay, make sure Rob wasn't drinking, wasn't yelling, wasn't doing any of the things he'd done before he'd gotten sober. Her hand stilled on the deadbolt. It was an 8-hour walk to anywhere with a phone. And Keith had said not to leave the unit after the siren, and Frank had warned her to stay inside. And those voices weren't real. They couldn't be real. Emma and Michael were safe in Columbus. Jennifer had called this morning. Rob had said they were watching cartoons. Everything was fine. Everything was fine. She backed away from the door. "You always choose yourself." Emma's voice, cold and hollow. "That's why Daddy left. That's why we don't love you anymore." Jennifer collapsed on the bed and sobbed. Keith, 11. Keith paced the small space between the kitchenette and the bed, unable to sit still anymore. Sarah Connolly followed him in every surface, her broken face tracking his movement, getting closer with each passing minute, her features now pressed against the glass from the other side, flattening grotesquely. "Turn around, Keith." Her voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "Look at me. Really look at me. No, you owe me that much. Face what you did." Keith grabbed the iron horseshoe from above the door and held it in front of the window. The reflection rippled like water. Sarah's face distorted, her mouth opening in a silent scream. But she didn't disappear, just pulled back slightly, regrouping. "Coward," she hissed. "You were a coward then, and you're a coward now." "Yeah," Keith's voice cracked. I am." He couldn't look away anymore. Sarah's face filled every reflective surface, and Keith stood in the middle of Unit 8, surrounded by her accusations. Her eyes bored into his from a dozen different angles. Her name was Sarah Connolly. The voices layered over each other, speaking in unison. She was 23 years old. She was driving to her sister's house. A drunk driver hit her. He drove away, and then you drove away. 2 men left me to die. Keith's face was wet. He hadn't realized he was crying. "I didn't know you. I didn't know your name. You know it now. Sarah Connolly. Say it. Sarah Connolly. Good. Now turn around and face me. Give me what you owe me." Keith's body tensed. His hands curled into fists. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to look at the space behind him where Sarah Connolly should be standing. Where she was standing, somehow, despite being dead 6 months, despite being impossible. One turn. That's all it would take. One turn and he could face her, really see her. Stop hiding behind reflections and iron horseshoes and Frank's warnings. His foot shifted, started to pivot. Jennifer stood in front of the bathroom mirror deliberately, forced herself to look. Emma and Michael stared back at her from the reflection, their hollow eyes unblinking, their pale skin nearly translucent in the harsh light. "You're not my children," Jennifer said. Her voice shook but held. The figures tilted their heads in unison. "Yes, we are," Emma said. "No." Jennifer's hands gripped the sink edge. "My children are safe in Columbus. My children are alive." "Are you sure?" Michael's voice carried a question that twisted in Jennifer's gut. "Yes." "Then why do you feel so guilty?" Jennifer's breath hitched. "Because I do. Because I left them. Because their father is an alcoholic, and I'm a bad mother, and I shouldn't have come here." The children smiled in the reflection, and their smiles were wrong, too wide, too many teeth, mouths stretching further than mouths should stretch. "There it is," Emma said. "The truth. Now turn around and look at us." Michael's hollow eyes gleamed. "Really look at us." Jennifer's muscles tensed. Her children were behind her, right behind her. All she had to do was turn around, look at them, prove to herself they were real, or prove to herself they weren't. One turn. That's all it would take. In Unit 5, Jennifer stood facing the bathroom mirror, her children's reflections reaching through the glass with impossible hands. In Unit 8, Keith stood facing the window, Sarah Connolly's broken form pressing against it from outside. Both of them on the verge of turning, both of them knowing that if they did, something terrible would happen. Both of them unable to resist the overwhelming urge to just give in. Turn around, face us, stop hiding. The clock radio in both units clicked to 12 a.m. The reflections vanished. Both rooms went silent. Jennifer collapsed on the bathroom floor, gasping. Keith collapsed in the chair, hands over his face. They'd survived midnight. They'd survived. But Sunday night was coming, and they both knew it would be worse. Scene 9. Frank's warning. They arrived at the office at the same time. Keith had been standing outside Unit 8 at 7:45, smoking and staring at nothing, when Jennifer emerged from Unit 5 looking like death. Neither spoke as they walked across the parking lot. What was there to say? Frank sat at his desk working on paperwork like it was any other Sunday morning. Like two people hadn't spent the night fighting off reflections that wanted to drown them. He looked up as they entered, his weathered face showing no surprise at their haggard appearance. "Coffee's fresh," he said, gesturing toward the pot on the filing cabinet. Keith poured 2 cups without asking if Jennifer wanted one. His hands shook enough that he spilled on the counter. Jennifer took the cup he offered, and wrapped both hands around it like it was the last warmth left in the world. "Frank, we need to talk." Keith's voice came out rough from smoking and lack of sleep. "Both of us." Frank set down his pen. "Bad night?" "That's putting it mildly." Jennifer stared into her coffee. "I saw my children. They were trying to come through the mirror. Their hands." She stopped, shook her head. "It's getting worse. And I saw the woman," Keith added. "Sarah Connolly. She wanted me to turn around and face her." He met Frank's eyes. "You know what happens if we do that." "And did you?" Frank's voice was calm, too calm. "Turn around?" "No," they both said. "Good, that's how it gets you." Jennifer set her cup down hard enough that coffee sloshed over the rim. What gets us? What is this thing?" Frank leaned back in his chair. "The passenger wants you to face it directly, to turn around and look at where it should be standing. If you do." "What happens?" Jennifer demanded. "You drown. Water in your lungs. Even if you're on dry land, even if you're in a locked room, you drown." Frank's voice went flat. "Found 3 people that way over the years, all drowned, all with water from Nacken Creek in their lungs." Keith lit a cigarette with trembling fingers. "How do we stop it? You confess, out loud, to the reflection, the whole truth, no holding back, and you have to mean it." "I already confessed." Jennifer's voice rose. "I told them I was a bad mother. I told them I left them with their alcoholic father because I was tired. What else do you want from me?" "Did you mean it?" Frank studied her. "Or were you just saying what they wanted to hear?" Jennifer said nothing. Keith watched her face go pale, watched her look away. "That's what I thought," Frank said quietly. "What does that mean?" Keith asked. "The whole truth. What does that look like?" Frank stood and walked to the window, looking out at the compound. "It's not about saying you're guilty. It's about saying what you really did and why you really did it. The ugly truth. The part you won't admit even to yourself." Keith took a long drag on his cigarette. His mind went back to that night 6 months ago, to slowing down on Norton Road, to seeing Sarah Connolly on the roadside, broken and bleeding, to making a choice. "I drove past Sarah Connolly because I didn't want to get involved." The words came out before he could stop them. "I had fares waiting, and I wanted the money. Helping her meant police reports and questions and losing time. I chose money over her life." The silence in the office felt heavy. Jennifer stared at him. Frank nodded slowly. "That's the truth," Frank said. "Can you say that to her reflection?" "I don't know." Frank turned to Jennifer. "And you?" Jennifer's hands shook on her coffee cup. "I left my kids with their alcoholic father because I was tired, because I wanted a break, because for once I wanted to be Jennifer instead of Mom." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "And I gambled with their safety to get it." "There it is," Frank said. "But I love them." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "You have to know that. I love my children more than anything." "The passenger doesn't care about love," Frank said. "It cares about guilt, about the truth you're hiding, about the real reason you did what you did." Keith stubbed out his cigarette and immediately lit another. "When do we have to do this? Tonight? Tonight or never?" Frank walked back to his desk and sat down. "The passenger gets stronger each night. Tonight's Sunday. By Monday night, it won't be asking anymore. It'll be taking." "So we have until tomorrow to confess?" Jennifer asked. "You have until tonight. Monday night is too late. By then it'll be strong enough to make you turn around whether you want to or not." Keith thought about last night, about how close he'd come to turning, about how his foot had shifted, his body already starting to pivot before the clock struck midnight, and Sarah disappeared. "What if we just leave?" he asked. "Right now. Drive away." "You can try." Frank's expression said he'd heard this before. "But the passenger followed you here. It'll follow you home, and it won't stop until you face it." Jennifer stood abruptly. "This is insane. You're telling us we have to confess our deepest sins to mirrors, or we'll drown on dry land. Do you hear how crazy that sounds?" "I hear it." Frank's voice stayed level. "Doesn't make it less true." Keith watched Jennifer pace to the window and back, her movements jerky with fear and exhaustion. He understood the impulse to run, to pretend this wasn't happening, to go back to Columbus and normal life and reflections that just showed your own face. But he'd seen Sarah Connolly's face too many times now, heard her voice too clearly, felt her getting closer each night. Running wouldn't help. "Tonight," Keith said. "We confess tonight." Jennifer turned to look at him. Just like that? You got a better idea? She didn't answer. They both knew there was no better idea. Just confession or death, truth or drowning. Those were the choices the passenger offered. They left the office together and stood in the parking lot, blinking in the bright October sunlight. Neither spoke for a long moment. I don't know if I can do it, Jennifer finally said. Say it out loud. Admit it. Me neither. Keith pulled out his cigarettes. But I don't think we have a choice. Jennifer nodded slowly. We stick together today. Help each other get ready. Yeah. As they walked away from the office, Keith noticed something pinned to the bulletin board through the window. An old taxi receipt, yellowed and faded, the paper brittle with age. He stepped closer to read it. Fare to Ironwood Retreat. Payment, ironed. The date read 1977, 5 years ago. Someone else had come here. Another taxi driver, maybe. Someone who'd known about the iron. Someone who'd understood the rules. Had they survived? Keith stared at the receipt until Jennifer touched his arm. What is it? Nothing. He turned away, just thinking about tonight. Tonight. When they'd both confess or both die trying. And somewhere in the darkness, the passenger waited, patient as stone, hungry as always. Scene 10. The confession. Frank made sandwiches for dinner. Ham and cheese on white bread. Nothing fancy, but neither Keith nor Jennifer could taste them anyway. They sat at the small table in the office, picking at the food and trying not to look at the clock. 7:30. An hour and 17 minutes until the siren. You rehearsed what you're going to say? Keith asked. Jennifer nodded. She'd been rehearsing all day, pacing the parking lot and mumbling to herself while Keith smoked and tried to find words that would satisfy a dead woman's reflection. I left them because I was tired, Jennifer recited quietly. Tired of being mom, tired of putting them first every single day. I wanted to be selfish for once. I didn't care if it was safe. I just wanted a break. Keith set down his sandwich. That's the truth? Part of it. Jennifer stared at her hands. The part I can say out loud. They'd agreed on the plan hours ago. Jennifer would confess in Unit 5, Keith in Unit 8. They'd meet in the parking lot afterward. If one didn't come out by 11, the other would check. Simple. Clean. Nothing that could go wrong except everything. What if it doesn't work? Jennifer asked. What if we confess and it's still not enough? Keith had been wondering the same thing. Then we tried. That's all we can do. Frank cleared away the sandwich plates without comment. He'd been quiet all day, watching them with that weathered expression that suggested he'd seen this play out before. Keith wanted to ask how many people had tried to confess, how many had succeeded, how many he'd found drowned on bathroom floors. He didn't ask. At 8:30, Jennifer stood. I'm going back to my unit. Get ready. I'll walk you over. They crossed the parking lot in silence. The sun had set behind the trees, leaving the sky that particular shade of deep blue that came right before full dark. No stars yet, just that empty blue fading to black. At Unit 5's door, Jennifer turned. Keith, thank you for not thinking I'm crazy. You're not crazy. I'm not sure that's true anymore. She went inside and closed the door. Keith heard the deadbolts slide home, heard her footsteps moving through the unit. Then nothing. He walked to Unit 8 and locked himself in. The iron horseshoe hung above the door frame, solid and reassuring. Keith touched it once for luck, then sat in the chair facing the bathroom. 8:47. The siren wailed through the night. Keith counted the seconds until it stopped. Now they waited. Unit 5. Jennifer stood in front of the bathroom mirror. She'd positioned herself there at 8:50, wanting to be ready when they appeared. Wanting to face them head-on instead of being surprised in some dark corner. The mirror showed only her own reflection at first. Pale face, dark circles, hair pulled back in a ponytail that had come half undone. She looked like someone on the edge of breaking. Then they came. Emma and Michael materialized behind her reflection. But they were worse tonight. Skin grey as concrete, eyes completely hollow, not just black but empty, like looking into tunnels that went on forever. Their faces held no expression at all, just blank, judging masks. Mommy's back, Emma said, but Mommy doesn't love us. Mommy chose herself, Michael added. Jennifer's hands gripped the sink edge. I want to tell you something, the truth. The children's expressions didn't change. They just stared at her with those empty eyes. I left you with your father because I was tired. Jennifer's voice shook, but she kept going. Not just tired from work. Tired of being your mother. Tired of the responsibility. Tired of putting you first every single day. Emma and Michael remained motionless in the reflection, listening. I wanted to be selfish. I wanted to do something for me for once, and I didn't care if it was safe. I just wanted a break. The words came easier now, tumbling out in a rush. All the things she'd rehearsed all day, all the ugly truths she'd been carrying. I chose myself over you. Emma's hollow gaze didn't waver. You were supposed to protect us. I know. I was, and I didn't. I put my needs before your safety. Jennifer's voice cracked. I'm a bad mother. Michael tilted his head. Is that all? Jennifer's mouth went dry. What? Is that all the truth? Emma asked. Or is there more? Jennifer's carefully rehearsed words evaporated. I told you. I was tired. I wanted a break. I left you with your father even though I knew he might drink. That's the truth. No, both children said in unison. It's not. Tears started running down Jennifer's face. What else do you want from me? The real truth, Emma said. The part you won't say. Jennifer shook her head. I don't know what you mean. Then we'll wait. Michael's expression stayed blank. We're very patient. No. Jennifer's voice rose. I confessed. I told you everything. I was tired and selfish, and I chose myself over my children. What else is there? The children smiled, and their smiles were wrong, too wide, showing too many teeth, mouths stretching impossibly. But I love you. Jennifer was sobbing now. You know I love you, right? Even though I'm selfish and tired and a bad mother, I love you so much. Then prove it, Michael said. How? Emma's hollow eyes gleamed. Turn around. Look at us. Really look at us. Jennifer hesitated. I don't think I should. If you really love us, you'll look at us. The logic was irrefutable. Her children were asking her to look at them. What kind of mother refused? Okay, Jennifer's voice came out small. I'm going to turn around now. I'm going to look at you. She turned. The bathroom was empty, just white tile and chrome fixtures and the harsh glare of the fluorescent light. No Emma, no Michael, just empty air where they should have been standing. Emma? Jennifer's voice wavered. Michael? Then the water came. It erupted from the drain, from the toilet, from the faucet, from nowhere and everywhere at once. Black creek water that smelled of rot and ancient things. It flooded the bathroom floor in seconds, rising impossibly fast. Jennifer tried to run, but the water was already waist deep. She reached for the doorknob. Her fingers closed around it. The door was locked, from the inside. She twisted and pulled, but it wouldn't open. The water kept rising. Chest deep now. Jennifer tried to scream, but water filled her mouth, cold and choking and tasting of earth. She was drowning in 3 feet of water, in a locked bathroom, with the door right there and the world right beyond it, and no way to reach it. Emma. Michael. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Unit 8, 9:45 p.m. Keith sat in the chair watching the clock radio. 9:45. Jennifer should be done by now. She should have confessed and broken the passenger's hold and walked out into the parking lot to wait for him. He'd been listening for her door, for footsteps on gravel, for anything that said she'd made it. Nothing. 10 o'clock. Keith stood and walked to the door, checked the iron horseshoe. Still there. He unlocked the deadbolt and stepped outside. The compound sat quiet under a sliver of moon. No movement anywhere. Keith crossed the parking lot to Unit 5 and knocked. Jennifer? You okay? No answer. He knocked harder. Jennifer? Still nothing. Keith tried the door. Locked. He looked in the window. The lights were on, but he couldn't see anyone in the main room. The bathroom door was closed. Water seeped under it. Keith's blood went cold. He ran back to his taxi and grabbed the tire iron from the trunk. Ran back to Unit 5 and swung it at the window. Glass shattered. He cleared the remaining shards and climbed through, cutting his hand on a piece he'd missed. The living area was empty. Keith crossed to the bathroom door. More water seeping under it now, spreading across the floor in a dark pool. He grabbed the knob and turned. Unlocked. The door swung open. Jennifer lay on the bathroom floor, soaking wet, her clothes plastered to her body. Water pooled around her, on the floor, on the walls, dripping from the ceiling. But the sink and toilet were dry. The faucet wasn't running. The water had come from nowhere. And now it was disappearing, draining away impossibly fast. leaving only damp stains and the smell of creek mud. Keith dropped to his knees beside her, checked for a pulse. Nothing. Her skin was cold. Her eyes stared at the ceiling, unseeing, water still beaded on her lashes. She'd drowned. She'd confessed and tried to follow Frank's rules, and she'd drowned anyway. Keith sat back, hands over his face. No, Jennifer. God, no. He looked up at the bathroom mirror. Sarah Connolly stood in the reflection behind him, watching, smiling. Keith scrambled out of the bathroom and ran. Frank was already coming out of the office when Keith stumbled across the parking lot. The groundskeeper had a flashlight in hand and moved with the urgency of someone who'd heard breaking glass. I heard the window, Frank said. She's dead. Keith could barely get the words out. Jennifer's dead. She did what you said, and she's dead. Frank's expression went grim. Did she confess? Yes! She confessed everything, and it killed her anyway. Then she confessed wrong. Frank started walking toward Unit 5. Or she turned around. Keith followed, not wanting to see Jennifer's body again, but unable to stay away. This is insane. You said confession would save us. I said confession would break the passenger's hold. I didn't say it was easy. Frank stopped at Unit 5's door. Most people can't do it. They say what they think they should say. They apologize for being guilty, but they don't say the real truth, the ugly part, the unforgivable part. She tried. Trying isn't enough. Frank's voice was hard. You either mean it or you don't. The passenger knows the difference. Keith leaned against the wall, his cut hand throbbing. Blood dripped onto the concrete. I can't do this. After seeing her, that's exactly why you have to. Frank turned to look at him. She failed. Don't let her death be for nothing. Learn from her mistake. What mistake? What was she supposed to say? I don't know. That's between her and the passenger. Frank pulled out his cigarettes and offered one to Keith. They both lit up, smoking in the dark outside Unit 5. But I know you've got maybe 2 hours before it's too strong to resist. You confess tonight or you drown like she did. Keith took a long drag, his hands shaking. What if I can't say it? What if I don't know what the real truth is? Then you'll die. Frank's voice carried no judgment. Same as her, same as the others before you. The passenger doesn't care about your fear or your doubt. It wants the truth. All of it. The part that makes you sick to admit. They finished their cigarettes in silence. Frank went back to the office to call the police. Keith walked slowly back to Unit 8. Jennifer was dead, drowned on a bathroom floor in 3 feet of water that had come from nowhere. And tonight, Keith would face Sarah Connolly and tell her something he'd never admitted to anyone, not even himself. Scene 11, the final night. Keith walked back to Unit 8 with legs that barely held him. Jennifer was dead, drowned in a locked bathroom with water that had come from nowhere and vanished just as impossibly. Frank was waiting, not calling the police, not yet, waiting to see if he'd need to report one body in the morning or 2. Keith had maybe 2 hours before the passenger came for him. 2 hours before Frank would know whether to make one phone call or save himself the trouble. If Keith didn't survive the night, he'd be found the same way Jennifer was. He locked the deadbolt behind him and checked the iron horseshoe above the doorframe. Still there. Solid. But Jennifer had iron too, and it hadn't saved her. The horseshoe kept the passenger from crossing the threshold, Frank had said, but it wouldn't stop the manifestations. Wouldn't stop Sarah Connolly from appearing in every reflective surface, demanding her due. Keith pulled the tire iron from where he'd dropped it when he'd broken Jennifer's window. His hand still bled from the cut, blood soaking through the handkerchief he'd wrapped around it. He sat in the chair facing the bathroom, tire iron across his lap like some kind of talisman. Like cold metal could protect him from what was coming. 11:15. Less than an hour until midnight. The bathroom light hummed overhead, fluorescent and harsh. Keith stared at the mirror above the sink. His own reflection stared back. Haggard. 52 years old and looking every day of it. Cheap coffee stains on his collar, Marlboro ash on his sleeve. The face of a man who'd driven past a dying woman because he didn't want the hassle. Say it, he thought. Just say it now. Get it over with. But the words stuck in his throat, because he didn't know what words would be enough. Jennifer had confessed. She'd said she was tired, selfish, that she'd chosen herself over her children. And the passenger had told her it wasn't enough, that she needed to say the real truth. What was Keith's real truth? That he was a coward? That he'd kept driving because he didn't want to get involved? That he'd told himself someone else would stop? That it wasn't his problem? That he had fares waiting? He'd said all that already, in his head, to himself. Every single day for 6 months. So what was left? 11:30. Keith's hand tightened on the tire iron. The bathroom mirror began to fog, condensation forming from nothing, not from shower steam or hot water, just appearing like breath on cold glass. Then she was there. Sarah Connolly stood in the reflection behind him, young, maybe 23, like the obituary had said. Pretty face, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, but wrong, all wrong. Her skin had the grey pallor of someone who'd bled out on a highway shoulder. Her eyes were black pits, and her clothes were torn, blood-stained, the same outfit she'd been wearing that night 6 months ago. Keith didn't turn around, kept his eyes on the mirror, on her reflection. "Hello, Keith." Her voice was soft, almost gentle. "You know my name now, Sarah Connolly." His voice came out hoarse. "That's right." She smiled, and it was the saddest thing Keith had ever seen. "You looked it up, read the obituary, saw my picture." "Yes, but you didn't stop that night. You saw me on the shoulder, bleeding. You slowed down, our eyes met, and then you drove away." Keith's throat tightened. Yes. Why? Here it was, the question he'd been asking himself for half a year. Why didn't you stop? Why didn't you help? Why did you leave her to die alone on that highway? "I was scared," Keith said. "I didn't want to get involved. I told myself someone else would help, that it wasn't my responsibility." Sarah's expression didn't change. "That's true, but it's not all of it." "I know, then say the rest." Keith's hands shook. The tire iron rattled against the chair arm. "I don't know what else there is." "Yes, you do." Sarah moved closer in the reflection, though Keith still didn't turn around. "You've known it all along. You just won't admit it." The bathroom mirror began to multiply. Suddenly, Sarah wasn't just behind him in one reflection. She was in the window glass, in the chrome of the faucet, in the dark glass face of the clock radio. Everywhere Keith looked, Sarah Connolly stared back at him with those hollow black eyes. "You're running out of time," she said from a dozen reflections at once. "Midnight is coming, and when it does, I'll ask you to turn around. To look at me, really look at me." "I won't." Keith's voice was barely a whisper. "You will, because you want to. Part of you wants to give up, to stop running, to let the guilt finally swallow you whole." "That's not true, isn't it?" Sarah's voice took on an edge. "You live alone. You work alone. You don't talk to anyone. You drink bad coffee and smoke too many cigarettes, and you go home every night to an empty apartment where you stare at my obituary photo on your refrigerator. You've made yourself a shrine to guilt, Keith. You want to drown in it." Keith stood abruptly, the tire iron clattering to the floor. "Stop it. Then tell the truth." Sarah's reflections surrounded him. "All of it. The part that makes you sick." But Keith's mind was blank. White noise and static. What was the truth? What ugly thing lurked beneath the surface guilt, the obvious cowardice, the choice to keep driving? He didn't know. Or he did, and he couldn't face it. Then the water started. It seeped from under the bathroom door at first, just a trickle, then more. Keith backed away from it, remembering Jennifer's bathroom, how the water had flooded impossibly fast, how she drowned in 3 feet of creek water that shouldn't have been there. "Don't run," Sarah said. "You can't anyway. The door is locked." Keith tried it anyway, grabbed the deadbolt, twisted. It wouldn't move. Locked solid, though he'd been the one to lock it, and the key was still in the mechanism. The water kept rising, ankle deep now, cold and smelling of rot. Keith climbed onto the chair, then onto the small table beside it. The water rose to meet him, defying gravity, defying sense, knee-deep when it should have been inches. "Last chance," Sarah said. Her reflections were everywhere, watching from every surface. "Tell me the real truth or turn around and look at me. Those are your only choices." Keith's heart hammered against his ribs. The water was at his waist now, even standing on the table. In another minute it would be over his head. He'd drown just like Jennifer. They'd find him in the morning, waterlogged and cold, creek water in his lungs. Unless he confessed. But confessed what? Think, Keith told himself. What is it? What's the thing you won't say? He'd been a coward. Selfish. He'd driven past a dying woman. But why? Not just because he was scared, not just because he didn't want to get involved. Then it hit him. The thing he'd been hiding from himself for 6 months. The thing that made him sick to even think about. I was relieved, Keith said. The word hung in the air. Sarah's reflections went still. What? She asked. When I saw you on the shoulder, bleeding, broken, I was relieved. Keith's voice shook. Because it wasn't me, because I'd taken that same drive home from Columbus 100 times. Same road, same time of night. And that night, I'd stopped at the diner for coffee. 15 minutes. That's all. If I hadn't stopped, I would have been the one the drunk driver hit. It would have been my car crushed, my body on the shoulder. Sarah's expression changed. Something shifted behind those black eyes. I saw you dying, Keith continued, the words pouring out, now like poison draining from a wound. And my first thought wasn't I need to help. It was thank God it's not me. I was grateful. Grateful some stranger had died instead of me. And that's why I didn't stop. Because if I stopped, if I helped, I'd have to face what I was feeling. I'd have to admit that I was glad you were dying, that your death meant I got to live, that I'd traded 15 minutes of coffee for your entire life, and I was relieved about it. The water stopped rising. Keith stood on the table, soaked to the chest, breathing hard. The reflections of Sarah Connolly surrounded him, a dozen versions of her dead face watching from every surface. There it is, she said quietly. The ugly truth. Yes, Keith's voice broke. I didn't help you because I was grateful you died instead of me, and I've hated myself for it every single day since. Sarah's reflections began to fade. Not all at once, but slowly, like morning mist burning off. I'm sorry, Keith said. I'm so sorry. You were 23 years old. You had a whole life ahead of you. And I was glad it was you instead of me. I'm sorry. God, Sarah, I'm sorry. The last reflection faded from the bathroom mirror. Just Keith's own face staring back at him now. Wet, exhausted, broken. The water receded, drained away as impossibly as it had appeared. In seconds, the floor was dry, the walls unmarked, no trace of the flood that had nearly drowned him. Keith climbed down from the table and collapsed in the chair. His whole body shook. He'd said it. The unforgivable thing. The truth that had been eating him alive. He'd been grateful Sarah Connolly died. And now she was gone. The clock radio clicked over to midnight. Keith sat in the silence, listening to his own breathing, waiting to see if Sarah would come back. She didn't. He'd survived. Which meant Frank would make 1 phone call in the morning, not 2. The weight of what he'd confessed settled over him like a shroud, because saying the truth out loud didn't erase it, didn't make it better. It just made it real. Keith Barnett was a man who'd been grateful for a stranger's death, and now he had to live with that. Scene 12. The departure. Keith woke to cold morning light filtering through the curtains. He was still in the chair, still wearing yesterday's clothes, now stiff with dried creek water that shouldn't have been there at all. His neck ached. His hand throbbed where he'd cut it on the glass. But he was alive. Jennifer wasn't. He stood slowly, joints protesting, and walked to the window. The parking lot sat quiet under a grey October sky. Frank's truck was parked near the office, and beside it, a county sheriff's cruiser. Keith's stomach dropped. He'd known this was coming. Frank had said he'd call the police in the morning. They'd want to talk to him, want to know how he'd found Jennifer's body, want to know what he was doing breaking into her unit at 10 o'clock at night. Keith crossed to the bathroom and splashed water on his face. The mirror showed only his own reflection. Tired, older than his 52 years, but alone. No Sarah Connolly watching from behind him, no hollow black eyes judging him. She was gone. But the confession remained, the ugly truth he'd finally spoken out loud, that he'd been grateful for her death, relieved it was her bleeding on the highway instead of him. Keith's hands shook as he dried his face. A knock at the door made him freeze. "Mr. Barnett, it's Sheriff Donnelly. Need to ask you a few questions." Keith moved across the unit and opened the door. The sheriff was maybe 40, weathered in the way cops got after too many years of rural crime. He had a notepad in hand and the expression of someone who'd already decided this was going to be straightforward. "Morning," Donnelly said. "Frank Harmon says you found the deceased last night. Jennifer Morrison." "Yes, sir." "Want to tell me what happened?" Keith had rehearsed this in his head during the small hours of the morning, between midnight and dawn. Keep it simple. Don't elaborate. Don't mention the passenger or reflections or water that came from nowhere. We had dinner together in the office, around 7:30. She went back to her unit at 8:30. I went to mine. Around 10, I got worried. Went to check on her. She didn't answer. I looked in the window, saw the bathroom door was closed with water coming under it. Broke the window, found her on the floor. Donnelly wrote this down. You two know each other before coming here? No, I drove her here Friday night. I'm a cab driver, Columbus Cab Company. Long trip for a taxi. She paid cash up front. Good fare. Donnelly nodded. And why'd you stay here? This isn't a hotel. It's a... He glanced at the shabby unit with its institutional furniture and iron horseshoe above the door. What is this place exactly? Retreat. Quiet. Needed a few days away from the city. The sheriff studied him. Keith could see the calculation happening. Middle-aged cab driver. Dead woman in the next unit. Broken window. Cut hand. It could look bad. Could look like something it wasn't. Coroner says she drowned, Donnelly said finally. But there's no water source in that bathroom. Sink was dry. Toilet was dry. Tub doesn't even have a plug. You see any water when you found her? Keith's throat tightened. There was water on the floor, around her, but it was draining away when I got there. Draining where? I don't know. Donnelly's eyes narrowed. Mr. Barnett, I've been county sheriff for 12 years, and in that time, I've learned that Ironwood is a strange place. Frank Harmon's father built it back in the 70s. They say he built it for a reason, to keep an eye on something. He paused. You believe in that kind of thing? Keith met his gaze. What kind of thing? The kind of thing that makes a woman drown in a locked bathroom with no water source. Rev, they stood in silence for a long moment. Keith could hear crows calling from the trees. A car passing on Maple Grove Road in the distance. The normal sounds of a Monday morning. Finally, Keith said, I don't know what I believe anymore. Donnelly closed his notepad. The coroner's ruling it accidental. Can't prove otherwise. But I'm going to tell you what I tell everyone who comes here. Leave. Don't come back. And if you see anything strange, if you feel anything wrong, get out fast. I'm leaving today. Good. Donnelly started to walk away, then stopped. Did you see it? Whatever it was that killed her? Keith thought about Sarah Connolly's reflection. About Emma and Michael with their hollow eyes. About the passenger that fed on guilt and demanded confession. I saw something, he said quietly. I don't know what it was. The sheriff nodded like he'd expected that answer. Frank's in the office if you need to settle your bill. I'd do it quick, then get gone. He walked back to his cruiser. Keith watched him talk briefly with Frank near the office, then drive away down the long gravel drive toward Maple Grove Road. Keith packed his duffel bag. It took 5 minutes. He hadn't brought much, hadn't even planned on staying at all. Now Jennifer was dead, and he'd confessed to being grateful for a stranger's death, and all he wanted was to get back to Columbus. Back to his taxi, back to the life he knew. Even if that life was lonely and small and haunted by guilt. He carried his bag to the office. Frank was inside, making coffee on a hot plate. He looked up when Keith entered. Sheriff give you any trouble? No, he's ruling it accidental. Good. Frank poured 2 cups of coffee without asking, handed one to Keith. Drink this. You look terrible. Keith took the coffee. I told her, last night, told Sarah Connolly the truth. I figured, you're alive. Jennifer told the truth too, or she thought she did. She told part of it. Frank's voice was matter-of-fact. The passenger doesn't accept partial truths. You have to go all the way down. Say the thing that makes you want to throw up. The unforgivable part. Keith sipped the coffee. It was terrible, watery and bitter, but it was warm and real, and he was grateful for it. What was Jennifer's unforgivable part? Don't know. That was between her and the passenger. Frank leaned against the counter. But I can guess. She said she was tired of being a mother, tired of putting her kids first, but I bet what she couldn't say was that she was glad to leave them. That those first few hours driving away, she felt free, felt like herself again. That's the ugly part. Not that she was tired, but that she was relieved to be away from them. Keith thought about that. About the difference between admitting you were selfish and admitting you were glad about it. About the gap between guilt and relief. What about you? Frank asked. What did you tell Sarah Connolly? Keith set down the coffee cup. That I was grateful she died instead of me. That when I saw her bleeding on the highway, my first thought was, thank God it's not me. That I didn't stop because I didn't want to face that I was relieved. Frank nodded slowly. That'll do it. That's the kind of truth the passenger wants. It didn't make me feel better, saying it out loud. It's not supposed to make you feel better. It's supposed to make you honest. Frank pulled something from his pocket, a business card, faded and worn. You take this. Keith looked at the card. Harold McKinnon, Willow's Bend, Ohio. No phone number, just an address. Who's Harold McKinnon? Someone who understands what you saw here, what you survived. Frank's expression was serious. You're going to have questions, things you don't understand, memories that don't make sense. When that happens, you drive to Willow's Bend and you find Harold. Stahap, he'll help you make sense of it. Is he a guardian, like your father? He's one of the last. Most of them gave up in 73, decided the things in the hollow were too strong, too old. Better to let them be. Frank's jaw tightened. Harold didn't agree. He stayed. Still fights when fighting's needed. Keith pocketed the card. Thank you for trying to help us. Wasn't enough to save Jennifer. You told us the rules. She just couldn't follow them. Maybe. Frank walked to the window, looked out at Unit 5 where they'd taken Jennifer's body that morning. Or maybe the rules aren't enough anymore. Things are getting worse in the hollow, stronger. The guardians are gone. The wards are failing. Ironwood was supposed to be a safe place, but I don't know if anywhere's safe anymore. Keith followed his gaze. The compound looked ordinary in the morning light, just a shabby motel surrounded by trees. Hard to believe something supernatural lived here, hunted here, killed here, but Jennifer's body proved it. I should go, Keith said. Frank turned back to him. Your taxi's ready. Battery's working again. Of course it was. The passenger had been holding Keith here. Now that he'd confessed, now that he'd survived, he was free to leave. Keith picked up his duffel and walked to the door. Stopped. Frank, does it ever go away? The guilt? No. Frank's voice was quiet. But you learn to carry it, day by day, hour by hour, and some days it's lighter than others. Keith nodded. That was the best answer he was going to get. He walked to his taxi. The yellow Checker Marathon sat exactly where he'd left it Friday night, a lifetime ago. Keith threw his bag in the back seat, slid behind the wheel, turned the key. The engine started immediately, purred like it had never been broken. Keith put it in drive, swung around, and headed down the long gravel road toward Maple Grove Road, toward Columbus, toward home. In the rearview mirror, Ironwood Retreat receded behind him. Frank stood in the parking lot, watching. Unit 5's broken window was covered with plywood. In a few weeks, maybe Frank would rent it out again to someone else running from their guilt. Or maybe he'd leave it empty. Keith turned onto Maple Grove Road and drove east toward the morning sun. The radio crackled to life on its own, static resolving into a song. Eagles. Take it easy. Keith almost smiled, then checked the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. But he checked anyway, and he knew he'd check again tomorrow, and the day after, and every single day for the rest of his life, because the passenger was gone. But the memory remained, and some debts could never be fully paid, only carried forward, one day at a time. Epilogue. Keith Barnett stood at his bathroom sink shaving, the razor making slow, careful strokes through white foam. Monday morning, 2 months since Ironwood. The radio played low from the kitchen. Traffic report for Columbus. Light snow expected by afternoon. He rinsed the razor, raised it for another stroke, and caught movement in the mirror. Just his own reflection. No Sarah Connolly standing behind him. No hollow black eyes. No reflection that shouldn't be there. But Keith checked anyway, every morning. Every single time he looked in a mirror or a window or any reflective surface. Old habit now, one he'd carry for the rest of his life. He finished shaving and walked to the kitchen. The coffee maker gurgled, cheap grounds turning into something drinkable. Keith poured a cup and looked at his refrigerator. Sarah Connolly's obituary photo was still there, taped to the freezer door. Young, smiling, alive. He looked at it every morning now, not as punishment, not as penance, just as reminder. This was a real person. This was someone who mattered, and he'd failed her, but he wouldn't forget her. Beside the photo, taped to the refrigerator with yellowing Scotch tape, was Harold McKinnon's business card. Keith hadn't driven to Willow's Bend. But he kept the card there anyway, just in case. For when the guilt got too heavy. For when Sarah's reflection started appearing again in the edges of his vision. For when the memory of that night at Ironwood became too much to carry alone. Someday he might use it, might drive to Willow's Bend and talk to someone who understood what lived in the hollow, what hunted there, what demanded payment for old debts. But not today. Today he had fares to drive, coffee to drink, a life to live. Keith set down his cup and grabbed his keys. Checked his watch, 7:30. Time to start the shift. He walked to the door, pulled on his coat, stepped into the cold November morning. His taxi sat in the parking lot, yellow, ordinary. The same checker marathon that had carried him to Ironwood and back. Keith slid behind the wheel and started the engine. The radio crackled to life automatically. Dispatch calling with a pickup address. Downtown, near the Greyhound station. Some things never changed. Keith put the car in drive and checked the rearview mirror before pulling out. Force of habit. Making sure no one was in the back seat. The back seat was empty. But Keith checked anyway. He would check tomorrow too, and the day after, and the day after that. Every single time. Because the passenger was gone. But guilt remained, and some debts could never be fully paid, only carried forward. One fare at a time. One day at a time. One check of the mirror at a time. Keith pulled onto the street and drove toward downtown, the morning sun breaking through winter clouds ahead of him. Behind him, in the rearview mirror, the empty back seat stayed empty. For now.